Hello everyone and welcome back to Royalty Now, where we bring you face to face with figures from the past and talk about their history. Most of us have heard Beethoven's music, even if we don't realize it. But few know the story behind it, the struggles of a deeply troubled genius who fought against hardship, heartbreak, and the unimaginable cruelty of losing his hearing. Today, we'll talk about Beethoven's extraordinary life, and at the end reveal what he may have looked like in real life. So let's go ahead and get started. Ludwig van Beethoven was born on December 16, 1770 in Bonn, Germany, to his mother, Maria, and his father, Johann. From the start, Johann had big plans for his son. The boy had been named after his grandfather, Ludwig, who was a famous singer and director in his own right. Ludwig the Elder had taught Johann everything he knew, starting the family's musical tradition. Unfortunately, Johann didn't have the same success as his father, but he was still very keen to continue this tradition with his own son. By the time Beethoven was 4 years old, he would begin learning to play the keyboard and the violin, and it soon became obvious to his father that his son had inherited the family's musical talent. It was around this time that stories of a child prodigy named Mozart, dazzling the courts across Europe with his musical prowess, began to reach Johann. As a relatively failed musician himself, Johann began to dream of a life where his son was like this boy Mozart. He could live out his dreams of being a famous musician vicariously through his son. With this dream in mind, Johann immediately began to ramp up the intensity of Beethoven's training, getting local teachers to teach him the viola, the violin, and the keyboard in order to give him the best education possible. But young Beethoven's teachers were told to be harsh and demand the very best of the young boy, which often left him reduced to tears. One of his teachers, Tobias Pfeiffer, would go even further than that. Pfeiffer was an insomniac, and because of that, he would drag Beethoven out of bed in the middle of the night to practice, sometimes depriving the young boy of sleep entirely. When Beethoven began going to school at age 6, you would think that Johann would dial back the intensity a little bit, but if anything, his schedule grew harsher. Beethoven's midnight practices would sometimes turn into midnight concerts, entertaining friends his father brought home from the bar. This sleep deprivation would lead young Beethoven to become lackluster in every other area except music, especially in math, where he would learn how to add but had a hard time grasping anything else. Before long, Johann began to promote his son as a child prodigy, just like Mozart, and even lied about his age so that his playing seemed more impressive. The young Ludwig van Beethoven loved music, but deprived of any real childhood, he began to rebel against his father and his musical education. There were times when he would dig in his heels, refusing to perform at all, which Johann did not take kindly to. At first, Johann was able to intimidate his son into playing, but when that failed, he resorted to locking Beethoven in the cellar without telling him when he'd be back. Johann's alcoholism was also worsening, along with his temper. A childhood friend of Beethoven once remarked that there were very few days when Ludwig was not beaten in order to compel him to set himself at the piano. It wasn't that Beethoven hated playing music. He just despised the way his father treated him, as anyone would. Their relationship, never that great to begin with, would never recover. Although his mother Maria was a loving parent, Johann ruled the household with an iron fist, and she couldn't really do anything to help. Even at the young age of 9, Beethoven was staying away from home as much as he could. In the early 1780s, Beethoven would be hired out to earn the family some extra money by giving piano lessons to the children of an upper-class woman named Helena von Breuning. Helena was a warm and loving woman, and she could sense the sadness in this young man. She could tell Beethoven was a talented, intelligent, and sensitive boy, and she began to allow him to have dinner with her family, and eventually even stay the night if his father had been drinking. Beethoven later stated that Helena had become like a second mother to him. She nurtured his other passions aside from just music, like reading and poetry. Most importantly, Helena helped Beethoven overcome his shyness and give him the confidence to start making his own decisions, no longer allowing his drunk father to dictate his life. The von Breunings would also help Beethoven make new friends and meet people in the higher classes, which would be important for his career later on. One of the most important people he met at this young age was a man named Christian Neefe. Neefe also recognized Beethoven's talent and intelligence, and after becoming his teacher would go on to change young Beethoven's life by introducing him to the music of Bach, who Beethoven was awed by, later calling him the immortal god of harmony. Hearing Bach would probably be the equivalent of hearing rock and roll for the first time to Beethoven's ears. The music of his time was nice and easy listening, while Bach's sound felt more profound, emotional, and complex. It was around this time when the first documented mention of Beethoven's name appeared in a German music magazine in 1783. He would soon be hired on as Neefe's assistant, playing the organ at the chapel of Maximilian Francis, who was Marie Antoinette's brother, and now the Elector of Cologne, pretty much the ruler of the region Beethoven grew up in. Within a year, his skill allowed him to become a paid member of Maximilian's orchestra, becoming a professional musician for the first time. Neefe began to teach Beethoven how to compose his own music, and by late 1783, when Beethoven was 13, he was confident enough to publish one of his own compositions. The piece garnered him the personal attention of his patron Maximilian, and soon Beethoven was on track to become one of the most exciting prospects in Bonn. Unfortunately, his personal life would get in the way. By the mid-1780s, Beethoven's father Johann's own career had dried up, and in 1785 he was caught trying to forge a signature for expensive gifts that he claimed he was due. From then on, Johann became sort of a tragic comic figure in Bonn. You could usually find him yelling praise for his prodigy of a son and getting drunk at the pub. He was there so much that Beethoven and his siblings often found him sleeping in the streets. Johann's praise was also too little too late for his son. He had been hurt so deeply by his father that some of the trauma would take years to surface. With his useless father drinking all of his money away, Beethoven, who was still a kid, was forced to become the head of his household. Instead of enjoying time being a teenager or writing new compositions, he instead had to earn a living by teaching and working in the court chapel. For 3 years, this was Beethoven's life, taking care of his mother and younger siblings. But his patron Maximilian had not forgotten about Beethoven's skill, and in 1787 he summoned him to Vienna. Known as the City of Music, Vienna was a home base for many of the most genius composers of the time, like Gottfried van Swieten, Joseph Haydn, and of course, Mozart. Now, although it's debated by historians, it was reported that Beethoven not only watched Mozart play, but even was given some private lessons. The thrill would not be allowed to last. Weeks before he was supposed to leave Vienna, Beethoven was rushed home, summoned by his father. When he arrived, he found his mother in the most deplorable state, dying of tuberculosis. On July 17, 1787, Beethoven's mother, Maria, died at the age of 40. Although Maria sometimes had a hard time relating to her son, Beethoven would say that she was his best friend. Over the next few years, Beethoven endured some of the darkest times in his life. Once again, he was bound to Bonn by guilt and by responsibility. His little brothers needed care, and his father was reliable only to continue to ruin the family's reputation day by day. It wasn't until 1789, 2 years later, that 18-year-old Beethoven, after pleading with the police not to arrest his father after yet another night of drinking, had had enough. He wrote to the Elector of Bonn, Maximilian, and requested not only to be given half of his father's pension from then on, but also if Maximilian could order Johann's exile from Bonn forever. The sheer boldness of this request shows us our first signs of Beethoven's real personality. This is the action of a person who is very serious about himself, confident, and not at all under the control of his former abuser. He was officially his own man. Although it appears that Beethoven did eventually allow his father to remain living with him, he was rewarded half of his pension. This new source of guaranteed income, along with his younger brother's coming of age, finally allowed Beethoven to think about his future for the first time in a long time. Although he had not composed anything himself in the last 5 years, in 1791 he was commissioned to write a piece for the death of the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II, which you can hear a piece of now. Even after such a long break from composing, it seemed to have only matured his style, and as it turned out, his time in Bonn had not been a complete waste of time after all. Years of performances in the orchestra had given Beethoven the experience and confidence to bring his piano playing to an extraordinary level, and word of his skill had begun to travel. In the summer of 1792, Beethoven had just finished playing with the court orchestra in Bonn when he was approached by a man named Joseph Haydn, at that time considered to be one of the best composers in the world. Haydn offered Beethoven the opportunity to become his understudy in Vienna. A month before his 22nd birthday, Beethoven was once again off to the city of music. Not long after arriving, Beethoven learned that his father Johann had died. He did not return for his funeral. In letters to his brothers, Beethoven purposely left his father Johann's name blank, refusing to even write his father's name down. He was more than ready for a new chapter in his life. Even though he was studying under one of the greatest composers of his time, after just a short period, Beethoven began to complain that Haydn was not rigorous enough for him. Even as a young man, we see a sense of superiority and moodiness towards the people around him. Under Haydn's direction, Beethoven would study violin under a man named Ignaz Schopensing, a virtuoso violinist. Ignaz's skill on the viola and violin would later inspire Beethoven to compose music that introduced a whole new level of complexity and technical difficulty to the violin quartet. Yet when Beethoven was told that Ignaz complained about a particular passage being too hard to play, Beethoven replied, "Does he really believe that I think about his silly fiddle when the muse strikes me to compose?" He would later write a short song dedicated to Ignaz called Praise to the Fat One. And this is to a man that Beethoven called his friend. To Beethoven's credit, though, he did always seem to have a plan for himself. After only 2 years in Vienna, he was able to master the Viennese style of playing, and because of his connections with Haydn, he also earned a reputation as one of the best performers and improvisers amongst the nobility in Vienna. When Haydn decided to leave Vienna for London in 1794, Beethoven was expected to return home to Bonn, but he decided that he would make this new city his home. Because of his reputation, it wasn't long before he had many patrons. Although he had written works during his time with Haydn, he had purposefully withheld them in order for them to be released later with a greater chance of success. Soon he made his first public debut in Vienna, and over the course of 3 days, he performed 3 piano trios that you can hear now. The audience was dazzled, and it was here that Beethoven decided to finally begin publishing his music. This piece would end up becoming Opus No. 1. His plan had worked. Opus No. 1 was a financial success, and for the first time in his life, Beethoven was on his own. He had escaped his abusive father, gained the respect of Vienna's aristocracy, and was proving himself a rising star in Europe's cultural capital. Maybe for the first time in his life, everything was going right. Between 1795 and 1800, Beethoven's rise was unstoppable. He released his piano concertos, his string trios, and by 1800 debuted his Symphony No. 1, a bold and innovative piece that broke with tradition, signaling that he was not just here to continue Mozart and Haydn's legacies, he was here to challenge them. He became a favorite of Viennese nobility, particularly among a small group of aristocratic patrons, who paid him enough to keep composing without worrying too much about money. Beethoven's ability to characterize his emotions and play his pieces passionately are what impressed his patrons the most. In this piece, known as Sonata Pathétique, you can hear exactly what this means. When this piece was finished, roaring applause would erupt at Beethoven's genius. But while the world was celebrating his success, Beethoven began to notice something strange, a ringing in his ears that ended at the edge of his consciousness as he played the notes that he had become familiar with over the course of his life. Something had changed, and with dread, he realized his piano's voice was growing quieter and quieter each day. Beethoven was going deaf. For a long time, he told no one, terrified that if word got out, his career would be over. Following his doctor's orders, he would leave Vienna for a small village called Heiligenstadt. He'd hoped that some time in the country would be good for him and give him time to process. But instead of healing, he found himself suffering in silence. Desperate and depressed, Beethoven sat down and wrote a letter to his brothers. In the letter, he confessed the truth. He was losing his hearing, and the crushing realization of this fact had caused him to consider taking his own life. But he also wrote that it seemed impossible to leave the world until I had brought forth all that I felt was within me. So he returned to Vienna with a new purpose, driven endlessly by his terrible secret. His first symphony back was Symphony No. 3, which he had written for Napoleon as a symbol of the French Revolution. The piece was longer, louder, and more emotionally intense than anything the audience had ever heard. From his pain, Beethoven had begun creating something new. The Romantic era of classical music had begun. Over the next several years, his output was staggering. He wrote another symphony, a 2-hour opera, plus 2 more symphonies, No. 5 and 6. His Symphony No. 5 in particular might be something you recognize. By the 1810s, Beethoven's fame was at an all-time high, but with his hearing continuing to deteriorate, instead of pride and joy, he began to have terrible mood swings, shifting from deeply depressed to truly arrogant on a dime. It would get so bad that he even began to lash out at one of his longest and most loyal supporters, an Austrian prince, telling him, "Prince, what you are by accident of birth. What I am through my own efforts. There have been thousands of princes, and there will be thousands more, but there is only one Beethoven." Yet it was this type of behavior that made him all the more interesting to others. He was deeply mysterious and intense, a puzzle that no one could solve, a man that no one could reach. Behind closed doors, many women tried and succeeded to reach Beethoven. In fact, he was somewhat of a romantic. Time and time again, he fell in love, deeply and often. Yet the relationships never worked, collapsing under the weight of his insecurities, bad timing, or class differences. The piece we know today as Moonlight Sonata was actually written and dedicated to a woman that broke Beethoven's heart. Beethoven would never marry. Although he continued to write all the while, by the time he was in his mid-40s, he was almost completely deaf. During a performance in 1814, he couldn't hear how badly out of tune his piano was. And by the time he was finished playing, his secret was out. This would be his last solo performance. By 1815, he was appearing in public less and less, embarrassed by the fact that he had to carry around notebooks for others to write in when communicating with him. That same year, his brother Caspar died and left him as co-guardian to his son Karl. Knowing that Karl's mother was a drunk, he saw his own childhood unfolding in front of him again, and he put all of his effort into taking custody of his nephew. After a rough and bitter legal battle, Beethoven eventually won custody of Karl. Unfortunately for both of them, parenting did not come naturally to Ludwig van Beethoven. He was strict and quick to anger, obsessed with turning Karl into a better version of himself. But Karl just wanted to live his own life. Their relationship spiraled, and he became depressed and rebellious. When Beethoven heard the news that Karl wanted to join the military, he went ballistic. In response, at only 19, Karl shot himself. When they found him the next day, he was alive. He had missed, scarring only his temple. His only request was to go away from Beethoven and live with his mother. This attempted suicide by Karl destroyed Beethoven. The guilt of pushing him too hard, of repeating the same mistakes his father had made with him, rattled Beethoven to his deepest core. Beethoven's mental health was at an all-time low, and he began to have the same thoughts he had after he had learned of his deafness. But he knew that he still had a bit more music inside of him to give to the world. In 1824, Beethoven made a rare public appearance, premiering his first symphony in 12 years. This Symphony No. 9 was the first to include a massive choir, giving a voice to Beethoven's genius. It is considered by many to be his greatest masterpiece. When it finished, the audience erupted in thunderous applause, but Beethoven continued to face away from them. When a soloist finally turned him around, he gazed at the large crowd giving him a standing ovation and began to weep. It was the saddest and proudest moment of his life. His world was silent, but he had refused to be silenced. In the years that followed, Beethoven's health continued to decline. His stomach illness worsened and his pain became constant, but he never stopped composing. Beethoven died on March 26, 1827, during a thunderstorm. He left everything in his will to his nephew Karl. More than 20,000 people attended his funeral. Artists, musicians, poets, aristocrats, and common people all gathered to honor a man who had turned his pain into beauty. Beethoven didn't just change music, he changed what music could be. Before him, composers wrote for courts or churches. Beethoven wrote for us and for himself, for joy, for rage, for hope, and for despair. Beethoven wasn't just writing notes on a page. He was telling us that even when life is hard, when you feel broken, or when the world goes silent, there's still music left inside of you. So, what did Beethoven really look like? Luckily, because of his early success in the music world, we do have several life portraits of Beethoven, from his early 30s until the time he passed away. Each portrait shows his light brown eyes, full head of dark hair, and distinctive eyebrows. While we do have an early silhouette portrait made of Beethoven around the age of 16, the first true likeness is an engraving, made in 1801 by Johann Neidl. Beethoven would be around 30 here. This was made during his first true peak of success as a composer in Vienna. The artist created a master engraving plate for this portrait, which was replicated many times to print on music programs and marketing work. It's interesting to think that this is the face of Beethoven that your average citizen in Vienna would have been familiar with. In this era, there's also a small painting on ivory made by Christian Horneman, which is a really nice image that shows a lot of authenticity in its features. In 1812, the 41-year-old composer had a life mask made, cast by Andreas Streicher. The Beethoven House Museum considers this to be the most authentic and useful portrait of Beethoven, and it's the origin for most of his busts and statues. But just a year later, around 1813, we do start to see a change in Beethoven's appearance. After enduring hearing loss and depression, we see his personal appearance grow a little more wild, more akin to the romantic, emotional composer image that we have in our heads. His hair and clothing become a little more disheveled, and it was said that his manners in public were on the decline as well. The most famous portrait housed in the Beethoven House Museum is no doubt this one by Joseph Karl Steiler, made in 1820 when Beethoven was around 50 years old. It's really contributed to the popular image of Beethoven being kind of a surly, tortured artist. It turns out that extraordinarily high amounts of lead and heavy metals were found in authenticated locks of Beethoven's hair, which were analyzed by the Mayo Clinic. This would certainly have contributed to his ailments, behavior, and appearance later in life. I've used the life mask as the main reference for my image of Beethoven. I made the kind of classic image first, but then also created a younger version. I think it's important to remember that Beethoven wasn't always the surly, wild-looking man that we see in later images. At one point, he was a healthy, talented, and thriving composer. So, let's see Beethoven brought to life now.